Welcome to Non-Toxic. I'm Daniel Penny.
And I'm Andrew Lewis.
It's officially summer. Dads across the land are pulling the covers from their grills and scraping off last year's grease and burnt meat. There are few things more American than a family or a bunch of friends coming together for some flame-broiled cheeseburgers. Andrew, I sense you're about to burst my bubble.
Cannot wait to burst your bubble. So this week, I spoke to the journalist and author Joe Fassler, who recently went undercover and attended something called the Masters of Beef Advocacy Program, which is put together by, surprise, America's largest beef lobby. Joe published his findings in a recent investigation for The Guardian.
Okay, so what did Joe find in taking part in this alternative MBA program?
Primarily, Joe took a good long look at how the Masters of Beef Advocacy Program is essentially training an army of civilians to be staunch advocates for red meat. Their playbook is using cherry-picked data and pseudoscientific studies bankrolled by the industry to convince attendees that industrial cattle farming has no impact on climate change.
This sounds depressingly familiar. Global warming causing industry senses a shift in public sentiment against them, throws insane amounts of money into the zone with misleading marketing, buying all kinds of flattering media. Sounds a bit like big oil.
Definitely sort of playbook stuff. This all reminds me of a tweet that popped up after our conversation, actually, by our good friend Elon Musk. It made the rounds, generated lots of support on his side and lots of hatred from others.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah. Basically, in the tweet, he says, and I love how he just is sort of this climate change expert, I
He's an
guess because he
authority
has.
on everything. The view from space.
So he concludes in this tweet that farming is basically not contributing to global warming at all. But of course, the thing is, that's just false. The global meat industry, especially beef, it's an enormous contributor to global warming. It's not just the cow burps, it's also the forests that industrial farms are cutting down around the world and all the fossil fuel powered infrastructure that gets the meat from these farms to your mouth. To be precise, livestock production and primarily cows are responsible for an estimated 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. According to one study in the journal Science, every kilogram of beef consumed adds an average of 99.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases to the environment. How's that for you?
Those are really bad statistics. I'm not gonna lie.
It's honestly staggering. It really is. But for my conversation with Joe, I really wanted to get into the inside of this beef influencer movement that he was able to infiltrate. It's fascinating, it's horrifying, and really, I think it's just so uniquely American. It's all of that kind of rolled up in one really interesting story.
Okay, let's get to it. Here's Andrew talking with the journalist Joe Fassler about his recent article for The Guardian, what we're calling Operation Beefluencer.
Well, Joe Fassler, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks so much.
So let's start off on a unique note. Do a little role playing since it's early summer here in the United States. It's barbecue season, that kind of thing. I want to play in a little scenario here, the eco-conscious dad who isn't a vegan, but is becoming increasingly concerned about the role of beef in the climate crisis. I'm showing up to your house with a few packs of Impossible Burgers. You'll play Joe, of course, the recent Masters of Beef Advocacy Program graduate, and I want you to use what you learned in this program recently to convince me that, fake meat is a joke and eating as much beef as a man can take is really the right way forward. So I will start. I show up to the grill. Hey there, Joe. Hope you don't mind, but I brought some Impossible Burgers for the grill. I'm feeling pretty worried lately about how much industrial cattle farming is really contributing to the global climate crisis. What do you think about that?
Well, the thing about beef you have to understand is where most cattle are raised, it's actually ideal conditions for beef production. If you were to grow crops there, for instance, on a lot of these lands, it would be worse because those lands are, they're highly prone to desertification and they're not easy to plow. And so actually it's like a freebie, to have cattle in these lands. The other thing you might have heard is that methane is this powerful gas, but what you need to understand about methane is that it's really only in the atmosphere for about, a decade. Carbon dioxide, what comes out of the tailpipe of your car is going to be in the atmosphere, for hundreds of years, for a really long time. So, these claims are slightly overblown when you think about the fact that methane, it is a potent gas. That's true, but it just really dissipates very quickly.
Okay, wow, I feel steamrolled there. Very good, very persuasive.
I got more if you want it. Yeah.
So you learned all this from a free, by admission only online training course called, as we said, the Masters of Beef Advocacy or MBA program, which I love. This course, it's put on by the U.S. beef industry's main lobbying group, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. As you explained in your story for The Guardian, despite the acronym, there's no MBA waiting for you at the end of this thing. So tell me how you came across this course. How did it come into your life? And talk a little bit about this by admission only process. That sounds a little intriguing.
Sure. So I was assigned a story by The Guardian to look into this idea of, the beef industry's messaging machine, which really got some press towards the end of 2022 when the New York Times did a piece on some documents that Greenpeace, the environmental nonprofit, had discovered that showed some really close coordination between a center for research for, animal research at UC Davis, run by a guy named Frank Mitloehner, and some industry groups, including one group in particular called iFeeder that actually pretty much bankrolled the center and was very involved in setting it up as, almost a headquarters for communications around livestock sustainability. So I started Googling around and I started to find these documents that the beef checkoff, which is, for those who don't know, it's basically kind of a federally mandated program. And it's not just for beef, right? There's one for avocados from Mexico, and there's for different agricultural commodities, there's different checkoff programs. But basically what they allow these checkoff programs to do is to take a tax on each item sold, in this case, on each head of cattle that comes out of producers' pockets and goes into these marketing and promotion programs that, in theory, are supposed to help shore up the market for that product. So I started looking at the funding documents for the beef checkoff and started to find some really interesting things about their strategy. One of which is this Masters of Beef Advocacy program, which has actually gone on for quite a few years, sort of under the radar. It's trained over 20,000 graduates. It's got a Facebook group, which I've been part of and been lurking on for a few months there, of folks who are essentially being trained to be warrior advocates online and in person and encouraged to go kind of, lean into these conversations around beef sustainability.
Okay, warrior advocates, can you just walk me through, give me a sample of a course or one of the classes, what topics were covered? How were the lessons taught? How did we begin to form these warrior advocates?
Yeah, so it's a self-guided asynchronous course, and there's a number of different topics. One is certainly sustainability, one is about supply chain, one is about animal welfare, and in each case it's trying to train people with the information needed to tell the story of beef production in a positive way. Once you actually graduate from the course, you kind of continue to be part of this community and you're encouraged really to have these interactions, to kind of not take it lying down. A theme of it is be proactive, engage. If you hear, what they call misinformation, right? Or, misinformed perspectives around beef, don't just let it sit. Here's what you should do. And there's even examples of like, you meet somebody in the grocery store or something and they have some interaction. It's really trying to kind of take an approach that's anything but passive.
So the role play that we did in the beginning, I mean, it's funny, it's comical, but that's literally kind of a scenario that you guys worked through in this course.
Very much so. That exact
Wow.
scenario wasn't part of the course in my memory, but it was that kind of thing. Here's why you should gently, explain to them that they're wrong. And it's not that they're telling people to be combative. A big part of what they're saying is they're kind of like, consistently yes, but everything with a smile on your face, but don't make sure you don't end the interaction without getting these specific points across.
I wanna get to something in your story that you spent some time talking about, and that's this 2006 report that came out of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Can you just talk a little bit about how that changed, I guess, the broader perspective on industrial cattle farming, writ large around the globe, and sort of the impact that it had not on just regular people and the way that they envision themselves consuming beef, but on the industry itself and how they reacted to this report.
Sure. Yeah. That was a really important moment. So that's livestock's long shadow. And one of its central findings was that livestock contribute, 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, which is a significant chunk. And, I think you have to remember in 2006, I think that was when the year, An Inconvenient Truth came out. Some really important IPCC reports were coming out around that time. And so while we'd known about, the greenhouse effect and global warming and climate change for a while at that time, this was a moment when the real urgency of the situation began to be underscored for the general public in a way that felt new and felt, I think, more pressing than it had before. In other words, in a way, I sort of see it as the beginning of the moment that we inhabit now, and obviously
Mm.
we're at a much later stage now, and the sort of like ravages of climate change are more and more, immediately visible, I think, to people in our daily lives. But it was the beginning of the kind of modern moment of like, oh my God, we have a problem here and we have to do something about it soon. And so for this report to come out in that context, first of all, I think it was news to a lot of people that, oh, it's not just, air travel and cars and this stuff and smoking, smokestacks,
Totally.
that kind of thing. It's animals, it's our diet, it's land use, right? And this report made that connection really explicitly. What is definitely true is that it was a moment of sort of existential crisis for the livestock industry and for beef in particular, because the climate footprint of beef is much, much larger than it is for, say, pork or chicken. And so beef, for decades has been kind of locked in this struggle for market share with chicken and pork. It's lost ground, compared to what it used to have in the US as people have kind of, ate more and more chicken in their diet. And this is a moment where it's like, oh my God, we are exposed in this really sort of existential way. And since that time, the beef industry has made increasingly, significant efforts to try to push back against the idea that beef is a climate unfriendly food. And those efforts have really only increased and ticked up in the past 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's really interesting as I look through years of these strategy documents, even, 10 years ago or, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, the kind of idea of sustainability has more to do with animal welfare and that kind of lens. And really in the past 3 or 4 years, it's like climate, climate, climate. We've got
Hmm.
to talk about this.
That's interesting. I mean, there's a lot in that mid 2000s, right? Katrina happens. I think that woke up a lot of people with regard to global warming. But I wanted to touch on this sort of existential crisis that you talk about within the beef industry. This is a time you kind of talk about this in the story that they start to, and correct me if I'm wrong, they start to borrow tactics from the fossil fuel playbook. I think they hired some of the same people, or at least the same public relations firms who worked for big tobacco, big oil, throughout the 90s, 80s. Can you just give us some examples of those connections, of those folks who jumped ship or sort of added beef to their portfolio?
Yeah, so I was able to find through these funding documents quite a few different firms that have represented fossil fuel interests in the past and are representing, the beef are working with, are contracting with the beef checkoff now. And I think the reason is very similar. It's about, trying to push back and muddy the waters at a time when, if that doesn't happen, regulation, which I think is the thing that industry fears the most. It's the public perception, certainly, and it's the conscientious consumption, definitely. But I think most of all, what they fear is regulation. And they're explicit about that in some of the documents, that like a change of consumer sentiment could ultimately lead to regulations that they don't want. That, I think, is what they want to avoid. And the longer they can kind of muddy the waters on this and stoke consumer anger about, like, Biden's going to take away my hamburger and that kind of thing, the more sort of rope they have to, to make it another year, 5 years, or 10. And so it really is similar to, to the tobacco industry, which was about like, okay, let's cast doubt on these health impacts that we're seeing so we can continue to sell cigarettes at the rate we have been, or the fossil fuel industry.
Do you think they fear companies like Impossible and Beyond, or is that kind of just noise on the side?
It's a really good question. And someone was actually, I had a reporter asking me about this today. I think that they are slightly concerned about it and would like to push back. But the fact is that, the plant-based industry has its own challenges and struggles. It has a tiny amount of market share. That market share is shrinking, whereas beef demand worldwide is growing. So I just don't see it at this point that that's really the issue for them. I don't. I think another one actually is animal welfare. I mean, California just passed these new rules. It's I don't know if it's specific to beef, but it's to the animals that tend to be, lives their lives in confinement. That kind of thing can make it more difficult for the sort of high capacity, high throughput, Tyson's and JBS's, meat packers of the world. So at this moment, it's kind of like, I don't think it's true that they fear that the plant-based industry is going to be the David to their Goliath. But I think a smarter food policy that really prioritized, growing crops that actually directly feed human beings, as opposed to, spending a ton of our resources feeding animals first. That kind of thing is highly threatening, and that's what they want to cut off at the pass.
Before we go too far, can you just talk about Mitt Loner and where he came from and the work that he's doing and how industrial beef farming group is they're so dependent upon his work?
Yeah. Yeah, so he's a really interesting character, and he's an animal scientist. He studies livestock. He's actually not a climate expert. He's not an atmospheric scientist, though he kind of sells himself as one, which he is an animal science expert. He's a livestock specialist. And that's what he does. So that, first of all, I think is important to point out. He so much of what he does is, the science might be sound behind it, but the framing is deeply misleading in some way, and so I'll give an example. One thing that's being explored, though it's turning out to have all kinds of issues, is if you mix, a certain kind of red seaweed into their feed, they actually belch less, or they have less methane emissions, from their burps, which is why they're so, such a potent factor in climate change, is
Right,
because of
right.
how
It's
much.
it's it's not the farts.
It's not the farts, it's the burps. Because, cattle have 4 stomachs, right? They're constantly chewing their cud. and belching up their grass again and then rechewing it and then getting it down to the second stomach and then the third. And through all that belching and chewing and swallowing, they're emitting methane through their mouths. And that's the problem. So one of many examples is, okay, if we mix this kind of red seaweed into their feed, they emit less methane actually through their burps. So let's look at that. We can make, we can if we can lower the amount by 10%, for each animal, that's just a random number. That's actually a pretty big footprint of reduction. So it's that kind of thing, but there's a few problems with that. One is that, okay, so you could reduce it by 10%, say, through the seaweed, but if people were to shift to a diet that's more rich in plants and minimize their beef intake, that's like a 100%,
Yeah.
decrease potentially, or an 80%, right? So there's really no kind of scientific intervention at the farm level that's as effective as reducing our intake overall, which is part of the reason that this framing is a little bit misleading. But it's another thing too. Mittloner and his students will do some pretty good science within that very narrow lane of on-farm reductions, but then Mittloner will kind of take to the press or make these comments on his blog that just like kind of critically mock reductionist strategies or veganism or plant-based things, and in a way that his science doesn't actually show. And yet, because he is a scientist and because he has this important post, a lot of the time the public want to listen to him as a scientist, and the industry is very good about taking his claims straight from the blog post and being like, hey, this is the science, this is the objective truth. And so that's kind of how it works. It's like the playbook that I found with him is like, release a scientific study that shows some incremental progress, even though that would not be as good, as other things we could do. Make some comments about it that are exaggerating or kind of hyperinflating of the findings. And then the beef industry takes that to seed their own comms and kind of push their narrative as though this was a scientific finding and not just Frank Mittloner's personal opinion.
Yeah, it's like he's mixing, social media, the problem that so many people have, you put out something out of professional context and it says one thing and then you go on Twitter and just spout off and it's very different, which leads into my next question. Obviously, the beef industry, it's been working for a long time to persuade Americans to eat beef, for decades, right? Like I'm thinking of the beef, it's what's for dinner ads in the 1990s, or even the Atkins diet, which featured a lot of red meat in their menus. But social media has enabled the industry to really amplify and personalize the messages through influencers, and they amplify the words of academics like Mittloner, who for all his faults or whatever is still a scientist. But then through social media, through the internet, we have this whole new group, these kind of beefluencers, right? I'm thinking of the Liver King, that guy. I don't know if you know who he is, the so-called carnivore MD, Dr. Paul Saladin, who I love that his last name is essentially Salad. He's pushing meat-heavy diets. So I guess my question is, how are these beefluencer type people, how are they reflecting Mittloner's research in their silly TikToks and all their other, social media posts?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to understand about some of those types is that they're directly bankrolled by industry. So I didn't get into this as much in the piece, but one thing that I did find is that in addition to the kind of more in the trenches type Masters of Beef advocate people, there is a program that's working with, I think, a couple dozen, specific influencers who have, yeah, a large platform on TikTok or Instagram or whatever it might be. And they're literally, kind of on the payroll of the checkoff, or checkoff funds are compensating them. And I don't think that that's disclosed actually. So that's the kind of thing to be aware of. It's like the whole world of social media influencing is very, very murky territory, right? The claims coming out of Mittloner's UC Davis Center, and specifically his blog, and his Twitter platform, which are not bound by, the conventions of peer review, are absolutely the kind of science-y sounding claims that influencers use as their sort of raw material and to convey legitimacy in their own communications.
Do you think that the messages that Mitt Loner and these other influencers are putting out, and I could be wrong, but do you feel like they're sort of disproportionately targeting men? Do you think they connect with men, perhaps maybe American men, on just a much deeper level than with women?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I certainly think that there are sort of gender truisms reflected in some of the narratives. Some of the appeals made to women by people who are talking about this stuff online is like, this is good for your family, this is affordable, this is healthy, and it's kind of trafficking in the stereotypes of like the mother figure who's the primary shopper for the household and that kind of thing. And then there's definitely messages out there pitched at men that is like, this is good for your body, this makes you strong, this is what real men eat. You don't want any of that, that other junk that isn't for, real guys. And so do I know if that's successful? I don't know. I don't know how much it's resonating, but you absolutely can see these sort of gendered messages.
Yeah, I mean, if I guess if you just look across social media, the vast majority of these influencers are men, right? So they're just kind of maybe playing along with the sort of entrenched gender roles that have occurred in American culture for a long time.
Yeah, well, here's a really good example of that, right? And it's Jordan Peterson, right? Who has
Mm.
been he's a big sort of alt-right influencer. He talks a lot about stereotypical gender roles, and he's a kind of all meat diet advocate, right? It's all kind of there. And from what I understand, actually, occasionally he's been a figure at a few sort of ag conferences. And so there is some overlap between that kind of figure, this sort of meat eating, men need to be real men in the traditional sense, and actual, ag circles.
Folks like Jordan Peterson, are they pushing? I mean, I've sort of listened to his general spiels, but what are you aware of any kind of like specific health benefit factoids that they're trying to put off? What about that sort of pseudoscience element on the health improvement side of things?
Yeah, I think there's a lot about, protein and that the best protein comes from meat as opposed to other sources. And that's just not true. Like there are places in the world where people, actually do struggle with malnutrition and have a hard time getting enough to eat, where beef is actually, or meat is a really good thing for them to eat because it's first of all, it's sometimes something they can kind of raise themselves, if they're subsistence farmers, but it's densely packed, calorically intense, and it's got, some nutrients. And so in that context, meat can actually be like a really healthy and important food that's hard to replace. Most Americans are not deficient in protein, right? It's not an issue here. And yet there's a lot of this, kind of kind of rhetoric as though, Americans somehow need to really worry about this. And it's really misleading in that sense. I think another thing that has, a grain of truth to it is that, some of the plant-based alternatives, the meat alternatives, actually are very, very heavily processed foods, that do have a ton of ingredients in it. Some of that is scaremongering, but I think, there should, because these are so intensively processed, there's no sort of rules around what they can or can't have in them. And I think that, you shouldn't probably be eating a burger every day. You probably also shouldn't be eating an Impossible Burger every day, right?
Yeah.
And so, but they sort of traffic in the confusion and skepticism around that to sort of sow doubt about these alternatives when like really is like we just shouldn't be eating hamburgers of any kind all the time.
Today's episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Fruling, a New York-based snack company making next-level trail mix with heirloom varieties of nuts, berries, and whole-roasted cacao beans. Find Fruling products at select boutiques and health food stores or order directly online. Listeners can use the code NONTOXIC, that's in all caps, for 20% off orders at fruling.co/shop. Fruling, naturally delicious.
So that leads to my next question, sort of this seeding confusion and doubt. I'm just curious your thoughts on how this all sort of enables doubt about climate change and the actual impacts of, what the cattle industry is doing to the planet. I'm curious about how those influencing campaigns about the benefits of beef kind of bleed over into these same doubts towards climate change, these kinds of things among mostly men, it seems.
Yep, yep, yep. So I think that this is really important. People are nervous. I mean, I think it's shown that like there is a lot of climate anxiety. And I think a lot of people in the US do want to genuinely look for solutions. We just had these massive incidents of wildfire smoke sort of like taking over, major cities in the east of the US. I live in Colorado. We've been dealing with that kind of thing for a while, but that kind of smoke appearing in a place like New York or Washington D.C., I think is really eye-opening for a lot of people. And I think what industry would like is for when that happens, for folks to not think beef, right? To not think that their diet has any role in that conversation. And they're perfectly happy, right, to point the finger at transportation industry, right? Coal plants and airlines and all these things that really do deserve criticism. I think their goal, if there is any goal, is to kind of decouple the climate change conversation from the diet conversation. And that is their agenda here. And in a way, I think that's information people might or misinformation that people might be susceptible to or really warm up to because, I think meat is a culturally central food in the US. It's worked into a lot of people's diets, into their memories, into their lifestyles, into their communities. And to say, we need to rethink how we do this to some extent is scary to folks. And so if the industry can kind of seize this opportunity and be like, okay, but here's something you don't have to worry about. Like, yes, climate change is real. Yes, it's happening. Yes, like we need to rethink, our relationship to fossil fuels. But in this uncertain time, don't worry about your food. I think that's the win they're really looking for.
Industry and environmentalists might be able to work together. And it kind of leads me to my final thought. And it's about small scale cattle farmers, folks who really have little to do with big beef in any way. Obviously, you're not going to feed an entire nation, but you could feed a family, you could feed a community. So I'm just wondering about your interactions with small scale cattle farmers. Have you talked to them about their thoughts on the beef industry? Are they supportive of it? Are they completely against it? Where do they land?
Yeah. So I think that the interests of the big meat packers, the Tysons of the world, the JBSs of the world, and the small scale cattle farmers are actually fundamentally misaligned. I think they're
Hmm.
not playing on the same team. And I think a lot of them know that. And the reason is because cattle farmers, what do they want? They want to get the most money that they can get from each animal. And what does Tyson want? Tyson wants its raw inputs, cattle, right, to be as cheap as possible so that they can, sell it for the biggest markup. And so there's these two pressures where cattle ranchers want better and better prices. And what's being kind of pushed down on them is the market pressures from the big meat packers to kind of actually devalue the animals that they're trying to sell. And that happens in really specific ways. As you know, the beef industry is a highly consolidated industry. There's only a handful of really major, beef slaughterhouses in this country that do the vast majority of the work. And we've seen where when a fire happens in one of them and one of them is shut down, one of these big plants, all of a sudden, the ranchers are having to drive 6, 7, 8 hours to another plant, which now has twice as many people selling into it. And the cost of beef just plummets, right? And so I think actually what cattle ranchers want is they want to be fairly compensated for their work, right? And that's actually, I think, an opportunity here because they, in a way, should want what the environmentalists want. If there's no reason that cattle ranchers couldn't sell fewer animals and make the same amount of money. Why do they not do that? It's because we're falsely propping up the industry with these corn subsidies and soy subsidies that actually devalue their product ultimately. And because the packers have so much power that they can essentially drive the prices down due to their consolidation. What we need to get away from is not beef production writ large, but beef overproduction and beef overconsumption. And I think that, my mom grew up in an agricultural community, and she said that the old farmers she knew then growing up would say 10 cows is a living, right?
Hmm.
You could have 10 dairy cows and make a living. And milk is another one right now, right? Where like milk is virtually free. I mean, you can't, it's not free in terms of environment and labor and all this stuff, but it's so cheap that they can't make enough of it to make money. And so I think we need to find ways through regulation. And I think this is the kind of regulation that the powers that be in the industry fear to back producers out of this volume game and allow them to sell meat, but get more money for the meat they have, make a better product, and then reclaim some of that land, that intensive beef land. When they're selling fewer animals for more money, we can then use that land for other things, for forests, for other forms of food production, for natural landscapes. This is, I think, the win-win that policy should seek is like, let's not drive these people out. Let's not end this industry. Let's just back away from this intense volume commodity game when it comes to meat. And that's how I think we get those folks on the same page.
Yeah, time maybe to break up big beef. Well, Joe Fassler, thank you for coming on to Non-Toxic. Appreciate the conversation. It's fascinating stuff. Keep going undercover. Keep reporting on that NBA Facebook group. Can't wait to hear more about it. That's our show, everyone. You can find Joe's story at theguardian.com. We'll provide a link for it in the show notes, obviously. And while you're at it, check out Joe's website, joefassler.net, or his Twitter at Joe Fassler, where you can catch up on all his other journalism and editing. And I see a forthcoming novel called The Sky Was Ours. So looking forward to that as well. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Nicely done, Andrew.
Cool. Thank you.
I really thought this was a great deep dive into something that I had never really considered, like the way that fake science is produced and mediated and disseminated, especially with regard to something that's such a part of everyday life, like beef. We don't think about it as this really massive source of emissions, but also just this kind of like contested space. I hadn't really considered it in that way, like the PR firms, the secret budget lines, the marketing tactics, like all of that. It was really fascinating.
I think what was interesting to me, and I guess I had just forgotten it, is that this is also new, right? It basically began in the mid 2000s. I think before then, as Joe said, no one was really thinking about the meat industry's connection to climate, almost not at all. And to think how much it's now in the conversation is pretty crazy. Like, I have hope that Americans at least can kind of cut back on meat consumption a little bit just through personal choices. But for every American that makes that conscious choice, there's going to be another ad package coming through the NBA Facebook group, but prepping the influencers to push
Yeah.
harder, And the crazy part, and what Joe talked about, is that we don't have to stop eating meat. We can have cattle farming. It's totally possible. No one is telling anyone to stop eating meat entirely. It's just this mass market industry that we've created is very clearly unsustainable.
Have you reduced your beef consumption personally in the past few years?
I absolutely have. And it's totally a moral consideration. I'm not a vegetarian, but I do feel like by me eating less and sharing that opinion with other people, I have to hope has a little bit of an impact, I guess.
All right, that's the end of this episode. Thank you to our listeners and our supporters. Non-Toxic is funded through your donations, and we could really use your help. So if you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to www.patreon.com/non-toxic-podcast and become a patron today.
Non-Toxic is sponsored by Fruling, a New York-based snack company making next-level trail mix.
We'd also like to give a special shout out to one of our early supporters. Thanks to the guys at Gauged Thongs for supporting the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Music is by Nathan Sharp. Art is by Sam Creasy.
And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at Substack, where you can get a monthly update on anything going on with the show. And please make sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. But nothing does that better than telling somebody you know about it. Help us spread the word.